In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at modeling something that seems pretty straightforward, but if you're kind of new to Blender, these simple things can also be mystifying in terms of approaching. This object is actually a pegboard type of storage for just all kinds of miscellaneous items. And I actually have one of these, and it's from Ikea. You can attach hooks to it and trays and all kinds of things that allow you to store miscellaneous items. So that is what we're going to take a look at modeling today. Here in the start file, I have already set up the size of what the final pegboard should be about. It's 19 inches by 26 inches or so. And then down at the bottom, I've already put in place at the center of our 3D universe right here, some starting objects. And this is the basic building block of this pegboard, is this bounding box, which is 0.9 inches. I'm sorry I'm using inches. I know not everyone uses inches. It's just what I'm used to. And then I've put in for the counter space, which is where the hook fits into, this circular starting place. So we need to build out the counter space from this starting point. Press the Tab key to enter edit mode, A key to select everything. And I first want to press the period key to set the pivot point around which we transform to the 3D cursor's location. When I press Shift and D to duplicate this, and then R, we go into rotation, and then type in 180, and then click to get that to the other side. Let's switch over into vertex mode. I want to make sure I'm not an active tool, but select box, so I can marquee around these points, and let's dissolve these vertices. And then in edge mode, I can select this edge and this edge, bring up the context menu, and then do bridge edge loops. Press Shift and Space Bar, and then bring up the loop cut function, click once, and then add for 3 total cuts, and then press the S key and then Z, and we'll scale this. So now these are pretty important. We're going to be creating a subdivision surface object, and we need to have a boundary here between this curving area and the long straight region in between the two ends. Let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit, hold the Shift key and select these internal edges, and I'm just going to dissolve those, but we want to deselect the dissolve vertex option. Okay, so if we look at this quadrant, we're only going to be working on one quadrant. We've got 7 edges here. So we need to create 7 perimeter edges on this upper quadrant. So I'm going to leave the edit mode here and press Tab to go into edit mode here. And then let's bring up the context menu and just subdivide this. And let's increase this until I have 3 here and 3 here. And then let's select these. So we have just those. Press Shift and D to duplicate this, and the Escape key. I'm going to bring up the context menu and separate that by selection to become its own object. Press the Tab key to leave edit mode, and just this box, this piece of geometry, let's remove that. Come back over here. Let's go ahead and join both of these together at this point. Tab key takes us back into edit mode. This one right here, I'm kind of looking at this vertex, and as I sort of point up, that kind of tells me a perfect place to add a final point via subdividing that. So now if I select, or rather marquee around this quadrant, we have matching numbers of edges. Okay, so let's do this in edge mode. Bring up the context menu, and then we will bridge edge loops, and it matches. One key goes into vertex mode, Shift S, cursor to selected, select both of those, and then S, Z, and then 0. It's not strictly necessary, but I like that to be kind of well ordered. Let's switch over into face mode, select this polygon, press the I key. Let's do an inset about like that. And then E key takes us in just a little ways, about an equal distance, and then the E key one more time, and then X, and we'll remove that polygon altogether. So again, we're only needing to work on this one quadrant, and I am in X-ray mode, which means I can do a selection and it will get everything that's overlapped. So X key, and we will remove those faces. Okay, so let's come in here now and come back into edge mode and double click this edge, because we're going to create with vertex groups. We're going to create a vertex group for this, and we'll call this 4 edge bevel, and then make sure to assign that. Okay, now we're working on a subdivision object, and we don't necessarily need to use subdivision surfaces for this, but there are some advantages just in terms of the malleability of the geometry for downstream changes. So that's why I've decided to go in this direction. Let's come into our modifier stack. In fact, I'm going to leave edit mode. Let's come over and generate a bevel, add a bevel modifier to it. The size is enormous. Let's also switch it over to a vertex group. We're going to switch specifically to that 4-edge bevel, so it's only working on just those. But this is a really large value compared to our size by default, so I'm just going to decrease this. These modifiers are great for simple things like this because we can come in, let's do 2.5. I like that, and then I can increase the number of segments that I want. We don't need to do too many because, again, we're going to be applying a subdivision modifier to this. Let's go ahead and mirror this now because we actually, if we look at this in front view, we're only working on this one quadrant. Now, the important thing to consider before you do this is knowing where your object's origin is. And it's at the right location along the x-axis, left and right, but it needs to be down here. So press Shift and S, and let's take the cursor back to the world origin, and then come up to Object, do Set Origin to the 3D cursor's location, and now we can come over, add a new modifier of mirror, and it's going to initially do X, and then let's also do along the Z axis, and there we have that. We need to do a couple of things to make it work as efficiently as possible for subdivision. So let's go ahead and apply a subdivision modifier to this. So subdivision surfaces, we'll go ahead and just take it up to 2 temporarily so we can really see this. We can see that it's rounding the corners, and we're effectively working on a hard body model right now. And we really want this to be constrained to preserve that hard body nature as much as possible. And this edge tells me that there's ever so slight curvature coming from this area, pulling into this flat area, and I want to prevent that. If we turn off optimal display, we can see the native subdivided polygons. So let's press the Tab key to go into edit mode. And when I had done this loop of inset polygons, these are planar to all of these. Now, there are some visual artifacts, and it's a precision issue because I'm working at a fairly small scale. Ignore that for right now. But these and these polygons here, they're all planar to each other. And that allows us to come in edge mode and double click on this edge. And if we come over to where it says mean crease, if this isn't up, just tap the N key, go ahead and put a value of 1, and you see how it prevented these subdivided polygons from passing that boundary, concentrating curvature where we want it to be and where we don't want it to be. So we do need to now do it to the corners, which needs to be done in vertex mode. So we take that vertex and we do vertex crease, we type in a 1 there, and that takes care of that. Okay, now we're going to come back to this sort of downstream. I'm just going to show you why it is that I decided to go with a subdivision approach. Press the Tab key to leave edit mode, and then we can take this viewport level. Let's take it back to 0 for right now, so we're not dealing with too much visual clutter. Now we're ready to replicate this, and we're going to use another set of modifiers. This is the cool thing. This is all done by modifier stacks. So let's come in, and we want to create this repeating pattern, but they're staggered, they're offset, sort of like a checkerboard. So let's come over to add modifier, and we're going to add an array, and we're going to use this relative offset, which is super useful for what we're doing here. But in this case, we want it to go in one direction to the right along the x-axis, but we also want it to go up 1 total value along the z-axis. So it just takes the bounding box of the objects and uses that as a relative offset value. So we're using this stacking approach to the modifiers, and the stacking takes the geometry that you've created and it starts at the top. This first modifier modifies the geometry and then hands that off to the next modifier, which modifies the geometry and hands off its geometry to the next modifier, and it just works down the stack like that. So I'm going to call this one array 1 because now we need to take this and replicate it up along the length of what's going to be the pegboard. So this is where we would come over and add another modifier of the array type. Second one, we'll call this one array 2, but in this case we only want it to go up along the z-axis. So for factor under relative offset, we'll take 0 and we'll apply just a 1 in z. We can see that down there, but we want a count of 14 to go to the top like that. So we're going to come back to that, because what we need to do now is, let's come over here and turn off the final size marker. If we go into the display, we can see that we've got these holes here in the offset that we need to fill. So let's come down, making sure that pegboard is the collection that I'm about to create a new object in, and let's add a new object. I always take note of where my cursor is because that's where objects get inserted. So Shift A, we're going to create a new plane, and let's make sure it's oriented parallel to the view, and let's set it to the reference size that we're using of 0.9 inches. Okay, and so then just press the G key, and then B allows us to take this corner and snap it into that location. Super, super useful. Let's do Command or Control A on the PC, and let's just apply the scale on that. I'm going to press the period key to take the pivot and move it back to the active element. Okay, so now we need to do an array modifier that basically matches what we're doing with the counter space objects. Let's come in now and note that something to really train your eye to look for is when you've got an object selected. I like to have my view often in local, especially when I'm going to be doing operations that rely on doing something in a particular direction. So I'm in local, and that tells me that the object is rotated, because look at the local y-axis is going along the global z. So I'm going to press Command Control on the PC A, and let's reset or apply the rotation. You can see that switch to match the global orientation. Okay, so that's critical, because when we come over to the array modifier and add one in, it's using that local orientation. So let's come down to factor, and we want to go along the x. It's initially in the positive direction, so let's give it a negative value, so -1, and then we want to go 1 up along the z-axis. So then we just need to add our next modifier, just like we had done with the first one. So we'll go to array, and in this particular case, we only want to go up. Let's zero out x. We want to go along the z direction, so a value of 1, which is the total bounding box size of the object, but we want that total count of 14. Okay, and there we go. So now what we need to do is we just need to, let's bring back the final size object so we can see the reference. These need to be offset in the other direction. So if I take the original object with the counter spaces here, we'll add our next array level, and this one I will call array 3. And in this case, we're going to be going along the x direction, so we can replicate them this way. So we need to do a minus value. Let's do a value of 10. And that gets us just to the other side. So let's do the same thing with the plane. We'll call this, let me just call this fill, and we'll call this counter space, just for good naming convention there. So come down, let's name these equivalent to, just because I like it to be that way. Let's come over to the modifier and add one more array, which we will call array 3, and it likewise needs to go in the minus direction with the value of 10. Let's turn this off so we can preview that, and there we go. Now let's zoom way down here. Note that we need to turn smoothing on. So for the source object, then we just come up and we do shade smooth. We don't need to worry about any angle-based anything on this object. So we don't need to add that new shading smoothing angle modifier. We don't need to mess with that here. And we don't need to mess with that for the flat one, obviously. So now we just need to do the perimeter. So let's come down here and start in this corner since we're here. The 3D cursor is right there, so press Shift and A. Let's add a plane there. And in fact, let's come into the front view, and again, let's do that to view, and we're going to make it, let's just make this one 0.5. So right when we're here, let's just go ahead and do a Command A, Control A on the PC, And we'll just rotation and scale, we'll get those both retransformed. Move that down here and then press the G key and then B, and we're going to snap this to that location. So this is going to be the corner. So what I want to do is go into edit mode, so tab, and we're in vertex. Let's select this vertex at the bottom, come up to the vertex menu, and then come down to where it says bevel vertices, and let's bevel that. Sometimes you need to pull for a while. Get right to here. So I like doing this because I can see where my planar bounding edges are going to be, which are those two end edges, about like that. That's good. And then just come over and increase the number of segments. Since this is going to be a subdivision, we don't need to go overboard with those. So I think that works pretty well. So let's come into edge mode. Let's extend this up, select that edge, press the E key, and then Z, and we'll pull that up just a little bit. Let's zoom way out. Let's take this edge, E key X. We'll pull that out and we'll just put that there for a minute. Let's come back up here and let's pull this way to the top. And then when I get up here, let's zoom in and let's press the G key, Z, and then B key so we can snap. Take that right there and snap to that edge. Let's do the same thing down here. G, X, and then B, and we can take and pull that till it gets right there to that corner. I'm telling you, that snapping tool that they introduced in 4.0 is literally just so incredibly useful. We want to be able to mirror this, and so let's go ahead, press Shift and Space bar, and let's add a loop cut right in the middle there. Return, come back up over here, do the loop cut. I know it's Command R, I just like accessing it that way. Click here, and then in face mode, we'll deselect, or remove actually, that. So I've got exactly halfway up, which is what we need for symmetry. You only need half of it. Now we want to do symmetry modifiers on this, but the mirror modifier, but we want to make sure that we control where the object's origin is very precisely, because everything revolves around the object's origin. So I'm going to press tab to leave edit mode. So we're in object mode. And if I press the G key now and move, it moves the object. Okay. But I want it to move the object's origin. So we're going to come up here to where it says options and we move the origin. And then I can grab and I can move that over there. But we want it to snap. And that B key modifier that we've been using doesn't work with the origin. So this is where we go back and use Blender's older snapping functions. So you come up here, click snapping and make sure it's set to vertex mode. And then when I press the G key, moving the origin, it'll snap right there. Now we need to do the same thing. We're only halfway there because the other part is the origin center is indicated by the top here. So G key, but we don't want it to snap there. So press Z so it only moves along the Z axis, and then you move the mouse over that snapping point. And now we get it in the correct location. So now we can add a modifier. Let's come back over to our modifiers for this perimeter object. And we just need to add that mirror, which is the symmetry operation. The default X works. And then, so now we would go along the Z, and that works correctly. So now what we need to do is give it a bit of thickness and rounding. Let's press the tab key. Let's go into edit mode and let's zoom down over here. Let's select this face, bring up the context menu, and we're going to invoke poke, and then take in vertex mode this center vertex right there and select this one, which is where we want to anchor it. Bring up the context menu, come down to where it says merge vertices at last. And there, that gets that in nice and corrected. So now we need to extrude some edges. So come over here into edge mode, double click the perimeter like that. And then we press the E key and then Y. So we only go along the Y direction. I'm going to pull out about like that. Let's double click on this edge and let's do a bevel modifier here. And this is going to be to produce the bounding polygons around what we're going to produce as the radius. So we need to come over and let's set this to a value of 2 and 1. And I want to be in, let's come over here into Active Tool, which allows me to just grab the edge and pull out. So I want to pull out, I don't know, about like that. Okay, so now let's double click this edge. Let's come back down here to vertex mode, or into the vertex groups, and let's create another vertex group here, and we'll call this one for beveling, something descriptive, ensuring that you click the assign button. Okay, and then we come back over here to our modifier stack and add modifier, and let's do bevel. In fact, let's do this. Let's take the mirror and move it underneath this. So it'll bevel the geometry and then it'll produce that. We're not going to just do angle. We're going to do vertex group for precision and then for beveling. And let's make this pretty small. Let's do 0.02 like we had done originally. And let's increase it. Let's do 0.1, maybe 0.11. That's good. And then increase the number of steps that we want. Now we don't need to go too high, it's going to be subdivided, so I think maybe a value of like that works pretty well. Tab key, bring up the context menu, and then add shade smooth to that. There we go. And then finally, the subdivider modifier will be the thing that gets added last in the stack. Now we got something kind of weird to handle, which is going to be easy to deal with. Let's go into isolation mode. So the backslash key, question mark, whichever you see on your keyboard. Let's look at this in the front view. Tab key goes into edit mode. So if we look at this in just the wireframe view, all we need to do, so the subdivided geometry is subdividing through this corner. So take this edge, hold the shift key, take this edge, come back over to the crease and assign a value of 1, and that takes care of that. But we want to also do the same thing here. I know it's a little hard to see. I was going to record this in Blender's light theme, but inevitably people complain about Blender's light theme. So take this, which is the boundary loop. Let's just spell this out. I really want you to understand what's happening here. So we've got all of these, which are planar, to these, okay? And it's this boundary between the two that we don't want the subdivision passing. So we come over and double click that, and that's where we come over to the mean crease and set that to 1, and that takes care of that for us. It makes it very, very precise for hard body modeling types of operations. Okay, so tab key leaves edit mode, and then leave isolation, and then we come over and we look at that, and there is our object. Now we're going to do one final thing. The benefit of the direction that I've gone is that it will allow us to easily modify this because we used subdivision surfaces and all these modifiers. So let's come in and modify this a little bit. So let's say that we've determined that we need to modify the shape of this counter space. So maybe it's a little bit thicker, a little bit squatter, and a little bit thicker. So let's do this. Let's come over here and come back into a wireframe view. And let's come into the front and in vertex mode, so 1 key. And I also want to be from active tool into select box, so it's easy to make this next change. I'm also being aware that I'm in X-ray mode so that I can select through these items, press the G key and then Z, so we can pull this down a little bit like that. In fact, if you really want to be precise, I should have grabbed that G and then Z, pull that down. Okay, so we need to expand this out. But I want to do a little bit more nuanced editing. So instead, let's press the tab key to leave edit mode, come back here to origin and go out of effect only origin. And we want to take the modifier that we've been using. So we only had to edit that one quadrant. Let's apply that so that we can edit it as an entire object. Tab key. And what we want to do is, let's come back into the front view here. We want to expand this outer boundary out because we want to thicken this, right? But if we just do a loop slide, like if I just come along here and we come down to the loop slide function, it's going to do that. We don't want that to happen. We want it to expand out in a predictable way, going out from the current shape, but maintain the shape. So if I rotate the view, let's also make sure and turn off snapping because we don't need that. That's going to cause problems. In fact, let's come over here, turn off X-ray, press the E key and then Y, and we generate some new temporary geometry. Okay, let's come over into face mode, double click, and now what we're able to do is take those and expand those out. If we come down here to the shrink fatten function, and we can expand those out along their own normals. So you see how I'm able to move those out. So if I undo and then I redo, that's what that allowed me to accomplish. Okay, so we'll pull that out. So this is going to allow me to create a thicker, fatter counter space. And then we just come back and we press the X key and we delete those faces. So let's come in and modify the bevel because we've got this bevel that's going on. We first need to maybe expand out. I'm going to press the 2 key to go into edge mode, select this. We'll thicken the whole object a little bit. Here's this boundary loop that we need to pull out a little bit like that. Then we come back over here to the bevel modifier, which is controlling the bevel. And let's take it to 0.05 and maybe just a little bit more, 0.055. Yeah, let's try that. And so what we've done is thickened this whole thing up using just a couple of modifying, polygon modifying effects. And that propagates to everything because we're just controlling it with this one cell, if you want to think about it that way. So I hope you found this to be a useful tutorial for how useful modifiers can be for this type of an object.